In this video, I'll try to explain what paint mediums, thinners, glaze mediums, flow improvers, what all these things do and whether or not you might want to check them out. I probably still sound pretty rough. I sound pretty rough to myself. I've had a bad cold since Sunday, which I mentioned was starting during the Every Other Sunday show, but luckily it's mostly getting better. Mostly. Speaking of the Every Other Sunday show, several months ago, I asked viewers there to suggest topics, video topics aimed at newer painters and hobbyists and wargamers. There were tons of great suggestions there, and if you have a topic of suggestion right now for new wargamers, please leave it in the comments below. I'd appreciate it. Anyway, this video is inspired by one of those suggestions from a couple months ago. There are a lot of products out there to add to your paint, and it can be sometimes pretty confusing. I'm going to try to help, but realize that I'm not an actual paint scientist, but I do own a lab coat. And speaking of lab, I'm going to be lecturing here mostly. Sometimes people like to comment in my videos that I should show, don't tell. And, sometimes they're not wrong. But in this situation, there's not much to really show, right? My goal is to explain how these materials are supposed to work and, what they're supposed to do. That is the lecture portion of the class. And then it's up to you to give them a try and to see how they fit in your painting workflow. That's the lab portion of the class. Just like when I was back in college doing poorly in science classes. Let's start with medium, as it's generally the easiest to explain. In most cases, medium is just paint without pigment, It's basically transparent paint, and not like washes or speed paints are transparent, even though they still have some color to them, I mean, medium is just generally colorless paint. If you want to make a blue opaque paint green, you mix it with yellow opaque paint. Yellow and blue make green. We're taught this in school and also in Ziploc commercials for all of our childhoods. But if you want to make blue opaque paint more transparent, you mix it with transparent paint. Yes, you can make opaque paint more transparent by just simply adding water. It's true. However, water is kind of a solvent in this situation, so adding too much can have negative effects on how your paint might act. Some paints take water better than others, and some paints can really start to split and get patchy when too much water is added. It breaks up the material that's kind of holding the pigment particles together, sort of, equidistant from each other in the paint, sort of. That's the simple version of it. You can really see this when trying to add lots of water to make your paints into glazes. Therefore, there's a subtype of medium to also talk about, glaze medium. Glazes are super, super, super thin paints that you layer over and over and over again to build up gradients on the surface of your model. Personally, I don't use too much glazing in army painting, but I will use it on HQ models sometimes, and I have used it extensively when I did that fancy display model that I entered in the Capital Palette competition at the Nova Open in Washington, D.C. last year. You can find out what I learned entering that competition here, pachow, but I'll tell you, I learned a lot about glazing. Glaze mediums are basically normal mediums, plus a drying retardant, a chemical that makes the paint dry slower than usual. Acrylics usually dry pretty quickly, much more quickly than, say, like oil paints, for example. You can also turn regular opaque paints into glazes by just adding water, but it's a bit more touchy to get the consistency just right and to make it so that the pigments kind of don't start to split and get patchy. And also sometimes too much water can make the finish of the glaze that you're making get real glossy, more glossy than you might like. It kind of depends on the paint. Finding a glaze medium that you like can take care of all of that. Then there's thinners. Thinners are basically mediums premixed with other fluids, frequently just water, but sometimes other stuff like flow improver, which I'll get to later. You could make your own thinner by just adding water or flow improver or whatever to a bottle of paint medium yourself, but there's also kind of a convenience in just picking up a pre-mixed bottle at the game store. You can also know that this fluid, this bottle of, thinner, was made to be a thinner and was probably tested and stuff like that. And that's kind of what you're paying for. When you mix up your own, then you have to do all the science and testing yourself. Personally, I have a tendency to use mediums more than thinners in my painting. And by that, I mean, brush painting. However, sometimes with airbrush painting, I do use additives to help my paint to not dry out on the tip of the needle in my airbrush. When I use regular Army Painter air paints, which are made for airbrush, obviously, then I don't really have to add anything to them. They always just work for me right out of the dropper. When I use something else and I need to thin it a little bit for my airbrush, then I use the Army Painter airbrush medium, which is technically a thinner. The Army Painter airbrush medium says thinner and flow improver right there on the front of the bottle. So in the way that I've been defining these additives, I think it should be called an airbrush thinner rather than a medium, right? Probably, if we're being semantic. But as with all paint manufacturers, some of this is just marketing. Back in the day, some of my favorite bottled glazes were from a company called Secret Weapon Miniatures, which is sadly out of business. And they were called washes on the bottle because most people didn't know what glazes were for, according to the owner of the company. Makes sense. Now, Flow Improver mainly does what it says on the tin. It makes your paints a bit more fluid without changing kind of the strength of the color. It's also what's known as a surfactant, which is to say it's designed to break surface tension in fluids, mainly fluids like water. Surface tension is kind of the invisible skin that's on the surface of a fluid. You'll see like bugs walking on top of it, like on a lake or whatever sometimes. And breaking it is really important, especially for things like washes when we're painting. Usually flow improvers are the main additive to making washes. If you decide to make your own wash by just adding water to some paint to thin it way down, and then you put it on, let's say, a Space Marine shoulder pad, it will look great until it starts to dry. And then what happens is, the dark color is all down in the crevice around the edge of the trim on the Space Marine shoulder pad. And as the water in the flat area starts to dry and it gets thinner and thinner and stretched more and more over the flat surface, the surface tension doesn't want to break, so it starts pulling the moisture out of the crevices and therefore pulling the actual pigment out of the crevices. And then it does finally break, and then you get what's called tide marks because it looks like tide came in and there's like this extra dark areas where you didn't want it. You wanted all the dark to be down in the crevices. Making that stuff break sooner, that surface tension break quicker, keeps that pigment down there in the crevices where you want it. Also, flow improvers can be very helpful for keeping your airbrush needle tip from drying out while you're painting with it, which is why it's in the Army Painter airbrush medium I mentioned earlier. Some pigments are generally bigger than others. So if I use a white airbrush primer these days, for an example, I almost always use the airbrush medium as the white is more likely to clog the tip of my airbrush versus other colors. You might want to try Flow Improver with washes and glazes too. Even just a little bit can totally change the way that your favorite paints will act. Do some experimenting. Lastly, drying retardant also pretty much does what it says on the tin. It slows down the drying process in acrylic paints. As I mentioned before, acrylic paints tend to dry very quickly. However, if you're trying to get into wet blending, right, you'll find it a bit harder to do without using some kind of drying retarder. When you want to mush two colors together on a surface to wet blend them together, it's best to use something to slow down the dry time for the two colors so that they can blend properly. In most situations, I would tell you to use these additives a bit sparingly until you get the hang of them. And then even then, use them on the side, right? Like when you order dressing on a salad on the side and they put it in a little cup so you can add it as you like instead of them just dumping a ton of dressing all over your salad for you, right? Don't usually squirt this stuff onto the blob of color that you've put onto your wet palette either. Instead, put a bit of it on the side, kind of next to that area, and then use your brush and grab some of the color and then put it over here, and then you use your brush to add a little bit of the additive to it, and then you have an extra area where you're mixing it all together. It's honestly a really great way to start. So what do I like to use, I hear you asking? Well, lately all I reach for in additives for my opaque paints is the Fanatic Stabilizer and the Fanatic Retarder from the Army Painter, the new box coming soon. The stabilizer stuff, basically it replaces what you'd usually call medium, in that it's Fanatic's medium, or colorless paint, but it's also got other active ingredients in it to, quote, help retain pigment dispersion when thinned to extreme levels, end quote, which I got straight from the horse's mouth. All I know is that it's very fluid, unlike some mediums that seem almost kind of gel-like, and just a tiny little drop usually does the job for me. Again, you don't have to use any of these additives in your painting. Using some water to thin your paints and being careful to not use too much will generally be fine, but trying a few different paint additives might help you out if you're getting kind of inconsistent results from your adding water to paint process. And then they can kind of help up your painting game when you become more secure in your materials and how to use them to get better results. What are your favorite paint additives? Do you use any? Do you make your own? Or do you just prefer to use water? Let me know in the comments below. And again, a reminder, if you have ideas for topics for beginner hobbyists and wargamers, drop those in the comments as well. This channel is all about helping new people get into this great hobby. I hope you liked today's video, and if you did, please hit the like button down below. It helps the video, the channel, and it helps me to get more folks into the hobby, hopefully. Subscribe if you want to see more videos every single Friday, and thanks for watching.